This is series one. Series one is Call to Holiness, as the call to holiness is extremely fundamental to who we are as children of God, to our mission, to his plan for us, and our purpose really is our call to holiness. So part one of this series is Life of Saint Maximilian Kolbe. As I said, he is patron of our difficult age and patron of those other things. Maximilian Kolbe was born on January 8th, 1894. There was a lot of discrepancy about his birth, whether it was the 7th or the 8th or the 9th, because he was born in Russia, who had a different calendar at the time. But everybody has settled on January 8th, 1894. He was baptized that same day in a little church called the Assumption, which was before the Assumption was a dogma. So that's pretty cool that there was churches named after the Assumption already. He was born in Zunskavola. This is the house that he was born in, but don't get too excited. He did not live in this entire building. He had a little side room. The family had a little side room up in the upper level. I've had the pleasure of going there, and it's a pretty small space. His parents were Maria Dabrowska and Julius Kolbe. They were very pious, very devoted, and Maria Dabrowska wanted to marry somebody. She wanted to be a sister, and she couldn't be a sister for reasons. And she said, okay, if I find someone who doesn't drink and doesn't curse, then maybe I'll think about it. And she found Julius Kolbe, who didn't drink and didn't curse. And so she married him, and they had a beautiful marriage that brought the fruit of 3 children, actually 5 children. Francis was the older brother, Raymond, St. Maximilian's birth name, Raymond Kolbe, and his younger brother, Joseph. There were 2 who died very young and affected, of course, very much the spiritual life of Maria. And I'm sure her children, though they don't talk about that much. We know that that sort of thing impacts everybody. When St. Maximilian grew up, he was a normal little boy. He was basically a latchkey kid in a lot of situations because his mother was a midwife as well as a weaver, and his father was a weaver as well. And so he would come home and he would often be the one to cook meals for the family, even starting at a very young age. He was also very smart, but he was also very normal. And so he'd get into trouble. And sometimes he was too smart for his own good. One story that may be legend, to be honest, I don't know, but it's in his books, is that he went to buy eggs. His mother needed some eggs, so he went to buy them. And when he came back, he had a chicken. And she's like, I told you to buy eggs. And he says, well, this will give us eggs, right? This is even better. And so he was reprimanded slightly for that and had to return it and get some eggs. So one of these days that he was being a little rascal, his mother says, what is to become of you? What is going to happen to you? And she was probably just yelling in exasperation. But for St. Maximilian Kolbe, it really struck his little heart. He was probably around 9 years old. And he went to the nearby church, I believe St. Matthew's. And he said, he went before the Blessed Mother and he says, what is to become of me? And that's when St. Maximilian had his famous vision. We don't know if it was an actual apparition or if it was more of a locution or whatever it was, but it was a very clear and distinct vision that St. Maximilian had, where Our Lady offered him a white crown for purity and a red crown for martyrdom. And she asked him, do you accept? And he says, both. I would like both of the crowns. And his spirituality changed overnight. His mother would say, what's wrong with you? Because she'd find him crying, and crying out of joy, crying out of remorse, just, getting teary-eyed. He began to become even more prayerful and more obedient than he already was. And this would impact the rest of his life because he knew that somehow he was going to be a martyr. He didn't know how, he didn't know when, he didn't know. St. Maximilian later talks about dry martyrdom, you know, a martyrdom that doesn't mean dying by blood, but dying to self. So he didn't make assumptions. He really was open to what Our Lady said, but he knew he had to give 110% of what he was in order to earn that crown, to really wear it. And of course, purity confirmed him in his priesthood. On September 4th, 1910, he enters the novitiate of the Friars Minor Conventual. Now, this is really beautiful because in order to go to the novitiate, as you can see here, there is no Poland on the map. This is what Poland looks like when St. Maximilian is born. It's non-existent on the map. So he was born in Russian-occupied Poland. I can't tell you exactly where. And he had to travel over the border down to the Austrian Empire to go to a Roman Catholic seminary. And so he hid in a truck with hay. He hid under the hay, and he was brought over the border, saying goodbye to his dad on the other side. So, you know, he left for the novitiate really not knowing if he was going to win, he was going to see them again, and how things were going to work out. But it was the beginning of his martyrdom. And then in 1912, he was very smart, so he went to Rome. One of the stories about Rome is that he didn't want to go. He was afraid of the women. He had heard stories that the women were all, I don't know what you might call cats, that they were going to be after him. And so he said, no. And the priest said, are you sure? Like, you're going? So St. Maximilian thought about it and prayed, and he came back and he said, you know what? Our Lady will protect me. I'll go. And one of the first letters home, he writes, everything they said about the women is false. They have much better things to pay attention to than me. So it was a broadening of his cultural experience. You know, he lived in a very small town, a broadening of, you know, in the Austrian Empire, in the Russian Empire, they didn't have influences from Rome particularly. So it was the beginning of his missionary zeal. In November of 2015, he earned his PhD in philosophy. So he was very young when he earned his PhD in philosophy. And the story goes that he was one day arguing on the train with somebody, and this older man looked at him and said, young man, do you understand that I have a doctor in philosophy? And little St. Max with his baby face looks up at the gentleman and says, so do I. And so caught the old man off guard, and the conversation, I think, came to a quick stop. In 1917, St. Maximilian in Rome witnessed the Freemasons marching on the Vatican. This is an actual image of the Freemasons marching in 1917. And they were very expressive of their anti-clericalism, their anti-Catholicism. So in the square of St. Peter's, they had hung flags and banners, and there were images such as calling the Pope the Antichrist, you know, something we've never heard before, right? And images of Lucifer crushing the head of St. Michael. And so turning things upside down entirely. And so St. Maximilian saw this, and he wanted to go immediately to convert the Freemasons. He just wanted to go to the big boss right away, and he was ready to go. First of all, he probably wouldn't have been let in. I'm sure it wouldn't have worked out on a practical note. But his superiors also said, wait and see what the Lord wants you to do. Wait and see what the Lord wants you to do. And so again, a very honest man of much integrity, he took that to heart. Always taking things to heart, St. Max. He was a softy underneath. And he began to pray, what does, again, the Lord want me to do? So on October 16th, 1917, he founded with six others, the Militia Immaculate, which is the Militia Immaculata here in the United States. It was very simple. You can see in the middle image an example of, a picture of the statutes, the mission, the goal and the means and the conditions of the MI, just on one little piece of paper. He didn't have this vision of necessarily millions of people doing all sorts of things. He just had a very clear mission, of conversion of sinners and heretics and bringing them to Jesus through Mary, through the total consecration to Maria. And this here is an example of the little, that's the room where the MI was started in Rome, and had a bigger table than that, but that kind of setup is what would have been. So in April 1918, he was ordained a priest, and he was obviously extremely happy about that. I don't remember what his first mass intention was right now, but I know that he wanted to be a great saint, and he was praying for that. And then the next day, April 29th, he said his first mass at the altar of Our Lady in Sant'Andrea della Valle. Frate della Frate. Sorry, I think I wrote it down and I just can't see it. See? All right. There's a beautiful story behind this altar. We're going to talk about it more in another class, so to speak. So I'll just leave it at a miracle happened at that altar to an atheist Jew was converted to Catholicism through the miraculous medal. Here's a picture of St. Max in his priestly garments. He is hearing the profession of fellow Franciscans. He finally earns his doctorate in theology in 1919. And then he would turn to Poland. Now, huge shifts in society happened when St. Maximilian in 1912 went to Rome. And then we know in before 1917, there was the World War I. And after the close of World War I, they redid the map. And so Poland got a place in history again. So you'll see, for instance, down here, Lvov was named something else. That was Austrian territory. This is where he went to the seminary. So just huge shifts occurred while he was gone. So also learning about cultures that way. Real quickly, because it went fast. In December 15th, 21, he got permission to print a journal. And the first one that they printed was shortly after that. He always was one to get things done quickly. And it was a press run of 5,000. Then they wanted to be able to do more, so they moved to Grodno up here. And in September 1926, all the way to April 1927, he was in a rehabilitation for his tuberculosis, right down here. His tuberculosis was severe, which is why he needed to be hospitalized, but he continued his missionary work in the hospitals. He would go out even when he was with fever and he was sick. He would even go out into snowstorms, in order to offer last rites to people. And he held philosophy, like group discussions, like small group discussions with the people, and tried to evangelize that way. So he was very. And then he moved to Niepokalanów. Niepokalanów is here, it's outside of Warsaw. So it's this circle here. And he founded what is known as the City of the Immaculate, that is Niepokalanów, and like I said, just outside of Warsaw, Poland. And St. Maximilian ended up with 700 plus friars at the height of the friary, and they did everything. So you can see them working here. I'm not even sure what they're doing, but they're working hard. Here they're probably cutting lumber for the buildings. They ended up having a fire station. So these are firefighter friars. That's a mouthful. Here you see them sculpturing statues of Our Lady. And this is a picture of him with his friars as he was younger. This is him as he's older. You can see he has the beard in both of these photos, sitting at a desk. This one nobody sees. When his desk is really nice, they don't think about it. But you see there's still a statue of Our Lady, and it's all fairly clean. Here, nobody knows what happened. It's very messy, and everybody loves that picture because they realize you don't have to be particularly neat to be a saint. So I remind them that saints all had imperfections, but they don't listen to me. And I'm not the neatest person around either, so I need to watch what I say. Practice what I preach. This is the press. St. Maximilian always had the best instruments for evangelization. They would literally share shoes, share jackets, share everything. I mean, they didn't share beds as far as I know, but I wouldn't be surprised if sometimes they did, because they worked on shifts, night shift, day shift. And so they were able to do things like share shoes. So they shared everything. They had little, aluminum or tin cups and plates to eat off of, chairs and tables that they fabricated. And yet he would buy the most. He went to Austria, he went to Germany, he went to Italy, and he would buy the best stuff for evangelization. Here is Neopokhalanov more at its height. St. Maximilian stands out. He's right here. His beard. These are just in different images at different times of his life. You see there's a lot of white in his beard, but St. Maximilian died when he was 47, so he wasn't that old. It's just he must have grayed and balded early. We see him welcoming different guests. He was very hospitable. He welcomed anybody to the friary. In fact, there's a picture, I couldn't find it. There's a picture of him. He's not thrilled, he's not smiling, but a picture of him standing next to a Nazi, a German soldier. And because the German soldiers would always come and check up on Neopokhalanov and make sure things were going according to their plan. And St. Maximilian had the beautiful audacity to always bring people to the chapel first and say, this is where the king lives, right? This is where the real man, the man of the house lives, here in this chapel. And then he would bring them to the infirmary and say, this is where all the work is really done. And so he evangelized by welcoming people and being hospitable, playing chess with them, doing different things like that. So he's very serious, hardworking, but he found time for other people, is the message there. He liked the youth. I'm not sure if these are scouts or who they are, but he's with them in the forest, doing some kind of work. And he loved the youth. He used to play chess with the younger in formation, and he always won. Then in April 24, 1930, he went to Japan. You see him on the boat, departing or coming home, I'm not sure. After being in Japan for just a matter of a month, he was able to typeset in Japanese. They got somebody who could do that for them. To my knowledge, they were the first non-Japanese to typeset in Japanese. So he was very hardworking and creative, and he wasn't afraid to ask people for things when it came to the apostolate. Now, they wanted to build the house, which was called the Garden of the Immaculata, in somewhere that was really easy to build. St. Maximilian insisted that it be built up against a hill and all this difficult stuff. And they didn't know why, but they went ahead and obeyed, thank God, because when it happened, when the bombing of Nagasaki happened, because this is in Nagasaki, his house, the friary, was one of the only places that was unscathed. And because it was up in a hill, people went there. It became a place for orphans to receive care, love, and food and shelter. Of St. Maximilian, by that time, however, as you can see in 1936, he was appointed guardian of Neopokhalanov. Part of that was because his health in Japan was so terrible. There were times where people had to stand on either side of him and hold him up so that he could celebrate the mass. There were stories of him having terrible boils. Obviously, the humidity was not good for his tuberculosis. And they lived in very austere situations. When they first got there, they woke up covered in snow. Their faces, their blankets, under their blankets, they'd have to throw the snow off of their beds to make them. And just very, very difficult. At one point, a Polish friar had brought them some sausage, and they were really excited. Polish sausage, right? And they hung it up in I don't know what it's technically called. I'll call it the attic. They hung it up there. And the next day they went to look for it, and it was gone. It was gone. And so it had been stolen by somebody. And St. Maximilian said, well, somebody needed it more than we did. Instead of grumbling, or he didn't even make a joke out of it. He's like, somebody else needs it more than I do. So very humble, very much in love with poverty in the spirit of his founder, St. Francis. Now, in September 1st, 1939, Germany begins World War II, invades Poland. And obviously, this is bad news for all of Poland. It is bad news for Europe. It's just bad news, as we know, ultimately for the world. From September 19th to December 8th was his first arrest. What people don't realize is St. Maximilian was arrested twice. This first time, he was arrested along with many of his friars. As you can see, the long line here of friars. We always point out how sad it is that the gentleman riding the bicycle, the German soldier, is smiling, and everybody else is very, very serious. St. Maximilian, you can't see in this picture. I like to imagine that he's in the back because he was waiting for all of his friars, all of his children to come out and to be with them and to encourage them on their way. St. Maximilian, during this imprisonment, made friends with a Protestant guard. And the Protestant guard went so far as to write a letter to Kolbe's mom, I believe, saying, thank you very much. Your son did X, Y, and Z. Or maybe he wrote it to the friary itself, because he probably wouldn't have had Maria's address. But point being, he did have a written testimony of how good St. Maximilian was while he was imprisoned and how kind he was treated. And St. Maximilian considered it, of course, very providential that they were released on December 8th, which is the feast of the Immaculate Conception. Now, December 12th, 1939, thousands take refuge at Neapokalanów. At least hundreds. I have to double check thousands, just to be completely honest. I don't know why it says thousands. It wasn't big enough. So hundreds take refuge at Neapokalanów. Many of them are Jewish, and this gives testimony of St. Maximilian's love for all people. Some people have a hard time with him praying for the conversion of the Jews, but the reality is he prayed for the conversion of the Freemasons, he prayed for the conversion of lukewarm Catholics, he prayed for the conversion of everyone. And so they took in many Jewish people at this point and took care of them. They gave them Christmas gifts, and they gave them then Hanukkah gifts, so that at his time, for him, that was very multicultural, to go outside of your tradition and recognize the tradition of another faith and actually celebrate it was very progressive, actually, even for a saint who was very, as I said, he was very, very strict, very down to earth, very, very faithful and obedient to the church. Thinking of something else, stay focused. In November 20th, 1940, he was given permission for a single press run. So St. Maximilian, during this time of the German occupation, while they were hosting refugees at the friary and They were left to be open because they were still supplying goods to the neighborhood. The Germans still liked them. They probably supplied things even for the German army, German soldiers. So St. Maximilian kept asking permission to print the magazine. And they kept saying no to him. And then on November 20th, 1940, he was given permission for a single press run, and it could only be 120,000. I thought that was rather generous. They could have said like 5,000, but they said 120,000. So St. Maximilian did the printing. I don't have a picture of the book, but it had an article in it, his very last article. And the article is on truth and how you can't change truth and how powerful truth is, because even if you say 2 + 2 = 5, it doesn't. Like, you just can't change it. And that was considered very much against the German ideals at the time, the Nazi philosophy. And so he was really pushing back. What I love about St. Maximilian Kolbe is how obedient he was. And we see how Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And Jesus, to the extent that he could be, was obedient to his civil authorities, his secular authorities. St. Maximilian did the same thing. I'm not saying there's not a time and a place to rebel against the authority, but St. Maximilian saw his way of evangelizing was to do things through obedience. So he actually took the time to get permission to do the press run, rather than just printing up a bunch of articles against the Nazis. He waited for permission to print against them. So I just find that very interesting. And also that St. Maximilian didn't want to cause problems where there already were going to be problems. And so he shaved his beard as well, because he knew that the Germans were all clean shaven and that a beard antagonized them and that they were stereotypical about people wearing beards. So St. Maximilian actually shaved his beard off. So in some of the oldest pictures of St. Maximilian during his imprisonment, you see he has no beard whatsoever. And so just a nice reflection in the obedience that he preached, what it actually was, and what evangelization can mean, and something for us to chew on even in our day and age. On February 17th, 1941, he was arrested and he was taken first to Paviak and then to Auschwitz. We've all seen this terrible gate that says work will set you free, or work sets free. Obviously, that wasn't true at all. They worked them to death if they were privileged to work to death. Otherwise, they were just killed for whatever reason. St. Maximilian entered. Here's an example of him without his beard. And they made him take off his glasses for the photo. He was prisoner 16670. 16670. So he was relatively early. Were very organized. So we do see the prisoner ledger in the Auschwitz Museum, and it says Thursday that he's which is number 16,670. So this early in the war at Auschwitz, he was already number 16,000. And then he was there from February, right? Paviak, he was transferred pretty early after that, and all the way until July 30th. You say all the way to July, that's not even 6 months. But they said that priests could live 2 weeks or something like that. The only people that could live less than the priests were Jews. Everybody else was entitled to live a month or something. So it was miraculous that this priest who caused problems was actually alive still 5.5 months later. When I say cause problems, I mean things like they really didn't like him, and he would still pray, and they would have him carrying the dead corpses. They would have him moving the heaviest things. There was no regard for his tuberculosis or anything like that. When he was in the infirmary, it was practically a death sentence, but he survived that. And when he laid in the infirmary, he asked to be by the door, even though the door would open and close and all that cold Polish air would come in. He wanted to be by the door so that he could give last rites or final blessings to the corpses that were brought out. So, you know, other stories, he one time was getting beaten by the Nazis, and a boxer named Teddy, there's a beautiful testimony in this book, which I'll share with you afterwards, The Man for Others, where Teddy actually wanted to go beat up the soldier. And St. Maximilian said, no, don't do it. Don't beat him up. This isn't what we're here for. And so he didn't want revenge. When it came time to make the big stand, it was again July 30th, a prisoner had escaped. And when a prisoner escaped, the penalty was 10 people were to die, because they needed to come up with something really grievous to try and keep people from escaping. But this prisoner escaped, and for a day, they couldn't find him. And during that day, the prisoners had to stand out in the square. And this is July 30th to July 31st. And you think of Poland as being cold. In the summer, though, it gets pretty darn warm. Plus, there's a lot of humidity. Plus, at that time, it was swampy area where Auschwitz was. So there's a lot of bugs. And so these famished, thirsting, sick people were just standing there for hours and hours. So people would just collapse in line, and you would just have to keep standing there. And so people died that way. St. Maximilian, by God's grace, hung on. And when they couldn't find the escapee, they came to choose the 10 people from that group that was to die. And they would do it in a very evil way, I can say. They would stare people down and then walk past them. Or they'd want to look in people's mouths, see how healthy they were, see if they had, what kind of teeth they had, look them up and down, hit them upside the head, just do different psychological tortures to these people in line. And so they all were called, and they're all in shock. So nobody's even crying out, nobody argues, because their spirit is so dampened, they don't even cry out anymore. But he got to a man named Francis Gajowniczek. This is Francis when he was younger. Francis Gajowniczek. And Francis, though he was a prisoner longer than Kolbe, still had fire in him. And he said, my wife, my children, my wife, my children. And that sparked it in St. Maximilian Kolbe. St. Maximilian Kolbe stepped out of line. Miracle number one. Well, miracle number one is that he's still alive. Miracle number two, he steps out of line and he's not shot on the spot. Because remember, they're very, very regimented, and you listen to them. And if you don't, the slightest infraction, you could be killed. In Auschwitz, there's towers surrounding the boundary of Auschwitz. And inside those towers are people with guns. The people at the front of the line who were doing the choosing all had guns. There were likely dogs, German Shepherds or something similar, ferocious dogs there as well that you could send on the people. But St. Maximilian didn't get shot. And he continued to walk. We don't know how far back he was in line, but he walked up to the front. And the witnesses, Man for Others, the witnesses say you could almost feel something crazy, great was about to happen. And nobody could believe that he was still walking up there. He walks up to the commandant, the person in charge, and he says, and they say, what do you want? I want to switch. I don't know what order, but he said, what do you want? He says, I want to switch with this man. And then they said, who are you? And his response was, I am a Catholic priest. Implying that he was good for nothing, that he was sick, that he was old for their standards, and that he was hated. So he's a much better person to die than Francis Gajowniczek, who obviously still had energy, though he was a skeleton. He still had energy and could still work. And miracle of all, they didn't say, great, 11 people are going to die today. They actually allowed them to switch. Francis Gajowniczek survived World War II, survived Auschwitz, And you can see him down in this corner near the time of his death. I believe he died, I don't know when he died, but he came to St. Christopher's in the 90s. So 95 he came here, right? He came in our house. Romello was there, so she met him. Yeah, and Anne would have met him too. All right, so they bring St. Maximilian to the cell, and this is a picture of the cell now as it stands. You can see there's a little window up here. This cell is underground, so this window is at ground level, but it looks out to what is called the wall of death, where they would just line people up and shoot them. So while St. Maximilian is in this cell starving to death, because it's a starvation bunker, he's witnessing people dying all the time. Everyone says St. Maximilian didn't just go into that cell for Francis, that he went into that cell for the 9 people who were going to die, because he did have this special charism to be with the dying. So he wanted to be with them and be a priest and bless them and pray for them as they died. Usually when people were in the starvation bunker, they would swear, they would get angry. While they had energy, they would fight. Blasphemies would come out of their mouths. They would get so thirsty, pardon me, but they would drink their own urine. Until finally their life gave up and they would pass away in a few days. St. Maximilian's case, they started to pray and they started to sing, and they prayed and sung loud enough, and it echoes down there, that the other cells could hear and joined in. And so eyewitnesses, man for others, testify that it became like a chapel down there, that St. Maximilian had brought Jesus to the starvation bunker, which is the role of a priest. And that's what St. Maximilian was to the very end. Some of the people he was with died. We don't know how many survived the full 2 weeks, but we do know that 2 weeks later, on August 14th, St. Maximilian was still alive. Still alive. That's another complete miracle. And the way that they did it is they came in and they needed the bunker for somebody else, sadly. And so they came in with an ejection of, some say carbolic acid, some say it's not certain. And they injected him, most likely in the arm. St. Maximilian, regardless of whether he was actually injected in the arm, St. Maximilian held out his hand, ready for the injection, as if to say, I'm ready for that crown of martyrdom. Stuck out his hand, they injected him, and without seconds, it goes and it stops the heart. So St. Maximilian, as we know, died on August 14th, 1941. His body was carried out of the cell, and the people who were carrying him out took off their caps. That was a signal they had arranged so that they would know, because the corpses, sorry again, all looked alike. They're just skeletons. So they would know which one was St. Maximilian Kolbe. They took off their hat and they walked him out and they brought him to the crematorium. When Maximilian died, they said, another eyewitness said that usually people were frozen with grimaces on their faces and contorted and twisted, and just, you could see misery and hatred on their faces. But St. Maximilian was just leaning against the wall, sitting up with his arm outstretched, and he looked clean, almost glowing, and that he had a slight smile on his face. A slight smile on his face. So they brought him out to the crematorium. This is art by a man named Maximilian Kolbe. Maximilian Kolbe has a huge, we'll share his pictures throughout the course, throughout the series, has many, many pictures of Auschwitz and some of St. Maximilian Kolbe that he hand drew with pencil. Some of them are as big as this room practically, others are very small. He lived Auschwitz. And what happened is later on in life, he had a stroke. And in order for therapy, they told him to start using his hand again. And so he decided to start drawing. And I believe moved by the Spirit and by his need for healing, he began drawing all these horrors of Auschwitz. And so his therapy for his hand became a therapy for the soul. And so they're very powerful. You can see here, St. Maximilian's eyes have light, because they said the last thing to go in Auschwitz was the light in the eye. They would just become dead. But St. Maximilian never did. When they brought them to the crematorium, and perhaps it was fulfilled St. Maximilian's wish that he gave, and that was that he would become dust scattered to the four corners of the world. He wanted to give himself so much that he was as dust scattered to the four corners of the world. Most likely, he meant that metaphorically. But God has a strange way of having St. Maximilian be very prophetic and of fulfilling that prophecy. Because on August 15th, they literally scattered the ashes just around. They put them through the chimney and they would just blow everywhere. Okay. Hope I didn't talk too fast. That is the life of St. Maximilian Kolbe. Let's stop at a happier picture. Let's stop at this one. Oh, actually, sorry for the movement. This is our website. We're going to talk together in just a minute, but this is our website, kolbemissionusa.org/en. If you want to check it out, you can. There's not a lot of current material, but there's still a lot of material there if you've never seen it. And there's a donate button. So this is offered for free. If you can't donate, do not worry about it.